Ever since we learned to fly, reaching further and higher, reaching for the stars. Stop. We've tried this once and we screwed up on that video, as you nicely pointed out. What we wanted to do in that video was explore this commercialization of space, and we might have gotten caught up with it in the nostalgia and my kid dream of going to space, and we just ended up with a video that didn't really accomplish anything. And we missed a few facts. I get it. So anyway, I think that this story is honestly too good not to be told. So we are kind of breaking our own rules and trying a video, the same topic again. Is it NASA or is it Elon Musk who will take the first human to Mars? Honestly, the line is very blurry. When you look at a mission to space these days, it's not immediately obvious whose launchpad we're looking at, or honestly, who's paying for the party. In 2021, space tourism became kind of like this mainstream thing again. It's not the first time it happens, but behind all of that, there are decades of private companies slowly but surely owning space exploration. And it does seem that private companies, private innovation is spearheading our way to space. So how did we go from this
one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind,
to this? So this story actually begins in the 50s, and trust me, it begins there, a few years after the end of the Second World War.
The debate about whether America would involve itself in World War II suddenly became moot.
All of these countries, these are countries with massively different ideologies. They all had to join forces. They all had to work together to defeat Nazi Germany and Japan and I guess Italy too. But anyway, this relationship would not last. As the war ended, as the world became this playing field to figure out who the next superpower would be, it was either capitalism or communism. So this Cold War had these two countries indirectly fighting for control. Many of these fights would happen in the soil and with the blood of poor countries and economies, but one of those battlegrounds would be space.
Russians clearly were ahead of us. Our country always seemed to have the right person ready when the right person was needed.
I mean, yes, of course, space is cool. The truth is out there. The answers about who we are and where we come from are all out there. But in the 50s, space was this race of ideologies. It was a true dick measuring contest between two rising superpowers trying to own the world, physically and politically. Now, in 1955, the US made this huge buzz about them launching their first satellite to space. And they were up for a nasty surprise, because in what looked ridiculous at first, the Soviet Union responded just 4 days later that they were planning to do the same thing. Now, the shock came when they achieved it.
CBS Television presents a special report on Sputnik 1, the Soviet space satellite.
Sputnik became the first ever satellite in space, beating the US's Explorer by a full year. And today, this may not seem like a big deal, maybe, but at this time, this was a shock to the Western world. Everybody went crazy. It's regarded to this day as the Sputnik shock.
Why and how did the Russians beat us to the draw?
We feel that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
And just 4 years later, a Russian cosmonaut would become the first man in space, again, a whole year before the US. So at the beginning of the 60s, the Soviets were clearly winning this Cold War, and not just in space. The president back then, that's JFK, he met with the head of NASA, who's called James Webb. And you heard that name recently. Anyway, he was desperate for options to turn the tide.
everything that we do ought to really be tied into getting onto the moon and ahead of the Russians.
And James Webb told JFK that there was no way that they were going to beat the Soviets launching a space station or orbiting or even landing an unmanned ship on the moon. That the only way that they could maybe, perhaps, out-achieve the Soviets was pushing to land humans on the moon first. And we of course know how that story ended, but nobody likes to talk about the context. There was a massive backlash here because this mission would end up costing the US some $28 billion. So if you adjust that for inflation today, that's about $280 billion. So about $1,000 in tax dollars per US adult today to fund this little race to space. And a lot of people weren't happy. Now, JFK's deadline, which was putting a man on the moon by the end of the decade, would put both the US and the Russians under tremendous pressure, which is not without its consequences.
In a few seconds, all three were victims of the swift inferno which left the capsule a blackened shell.
On the Soviet side as well, missions were being pushed without the proper tests or security checks. Dozens of attempts to send probes to Venus failed during this decade. And the Russians saw their first human casualty as well. So this guy called Vladimir Komarov, he knew that his ship was flawed. There were reports of him telling friends and his family that he was probably not going to make it. However, if he walked out of this mission, his replacement was going to be Yuri Gagarin, and he didn't want this national hero to die in his place. So he finally agreed to fly the Soyuz spaceship, which, as he expected, would start failing almost from the moment it took off. Even the US picked up part of his transmission as he was crashing down. And this gruesome photo of his burned remains is this crude reminder of everything that surrounded this launch and this whole race as a context. But when the US finally did land on the moon, they included Komarov and everybody who had died in the pursuit of space in this plaque that's still sitting there on the moon. And this plaque with everyone was the sign of a truce to come. Because while these two governments were battling it out, everybody else down here was also dreaming about space, because technology and culture were advancing hand in hand. Look at the recent blockbuster Dune. This was written in 1965, just in the middle of the space race. It coincided with the first images of Earth from outer space. So the novel tackled the environment, it tackled religion and society. Plus, again, combined with these first views of our planet, the book sparked this wave of interest in the future of space travel. Stanley Kubrick fell in love with NASA's photographs of the lunar surface. In fact, these images inspired him and Arthur C. Clarke to finally write the script for 2001: A Space Odyssey. Now, Space Odyssey beat the lunar landing by an entire year, and the lunar landing was huge. When a man landed on the moon in '69, everything became possible, from dreaming about houses in space to dreaming about living on another planet. In fact, both the film and the lunar landing were so culturally significant that some people just figured that the lunar landing was also a Kubrick creation, because this race was so intense and one country had to win it at all costs. And then, of course, there was Star Wars. This movie changed our perception of space. It was so important that it would influence actual space exploration for years to come. After the US reached the moon, this period of peace ensued.
Less than 5 meters distance.
We started to see some collaborations between these two space agencies. They started signing treaties and they agreed to launch space stations together. Now, NASA even had some plans to land humans on Mars as soon as '86, but this space race, it was kind of over now. And so was the funding. The money that allowed NASA to sprint to the moon came in many ways thanks to this Cold War. JFK used it as leverage to line up Congress behind this common, very important cause.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
But at the end of the 20th century, the Soviet Union was collapsing, and just Congress, they didn't want to spend too much money on space anymore. And the rally was over. And this wouldn't stop the rest of the world, though. You had France and India, North and South Korea, Israel, Italy, Brazil, Japan, Iran, China. They all developed the capability to launch ships into space during these last few years of the 20th century. Anyway, all these governments saw the importance of space exploration, either to demonstrate their power, to demonstrate the size of their economy, or just not to get left behind. And space became this collaboration ground between governments. They shared knowledge or jointly funded space missions. But for the longest time, space was a military, a government operation, an expense in the name of science or power, maybe a long-term investment, but most certainly not a business. Money was being made, mind you, but not from going to space, because between the 80s and the 2000s, we saw a lot of companies, mostly conglomerates, and even state-owned commercial agencies make tons of money working for the government, either as contractors or building the spaceships and the components. So while you saw that space shuttle with that big patch, NASA, they weren't the ones who built it. It was all outsourced. As time went by, funding for NASA decreased, and when the shuttle program ended, the US even lost the capability to launch spaceships. Hey guys, sorry to interrupt the video, but I want to talk about today's sponsor, which is ChurnMogul. We've been truly using ChurnMogul for years to track our SaaS expenses. We befriended their team, and now they agreed to sponsor our channel. Now, the reason why we use ChurnMogul is that we generate revenue from a lot of sources, SaaS and non-subscription revenue, and we consolidate all of that in their platform. So ChurnMogul lets us run cohort tables, lifetime value reports, and even filter on customer sources. For example, we can use the UTM tags to track the lifetime value of customers who came from a specific campaign or from a specific landing page, or maybe a specific country. Now, for companies with under $10,000 in MRR, you can use ChurnMogul completely free by signing up at churnmogul.com/Slidebean. If you have over $10,000 in MRR, you can use the code Slidebean to write off $600 of your first year on ChurnMogul. Thanks, ChurnMogul, for sponsoring today's video. Let's get back to the story.
Systems checks by the Russian flight control team in Korolyov. Supply vehicle bound on a 2-day journey to the International Space Station.
For years, the missions to resupply the US astronauts that were living in the International Space Station were operated by Russia. But years before reaching that point, the US understood that private capital, private innovation, capitalism, would unlock the next step in space exploration.
Freedom of opportunity to develop ideas which will make a better way of life for the children of tomorrow.
So in '84, they changed this very critical clause in NASA's mission statement. So NASA's job is no longer just space exploration, but space commercialization. And this was this very first key factor to how space was transformed today. The other factor was actually the internet.
The internet is amazing, and it's changing every day.
Because the 90s gave us this new wave of entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs that had grown up with the space age and with the vision and the funding to start companies especially dedicated to space exploration. So these companies that worked with NASA in the 80s and the 90s, they were conglomerates, they were mergers of mergers and defense contractors. But in the 2000s, these tech entrepreneurs suddenly figured that it was possible to line up venture capital, private capital, behind a space startup. Now, as of today, these are all the privately owned companies that have tested capacity to launch vehicles into orbit. And these companies are just this small sample of a much bigger group of private companies working in either engines or propulsion, suborbital vehicles, or that simply just haven't launched an orbital successful test yet. But in this video, I wanted to focus on the ones that actually can launch things to space, to orbit. So you'll notice that Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin is missing here, because despite all the fuss and the laughs, they've never launched anything into orbit. Now, in the weeks surrounding their tourist launch, Bezos threw some real shade at Branson, because Branson's ship was not going to be crossing the Kármán line, which is this line that divides space from Earth officially. And Bezos would. So their tourists were going to be astronauts and Branson's weren't. But Branson's company, established in 2017, had been able to ship their first commercial payload earlier in 2021, after just 4 years of starting the company. So we wanted to draw that into this little diagram. So first we have United Launch Alliance and Northrop Grumman. These are massive defense contractors. They've been working for NASA and for the military for decades. So I'm just not gonna count them for the exciting stuff in the 2000s, because they're both coming up on 100+ successful commercial launches with billions of dollars in revenue. So, you know, they've been around for a while. But anyway, I wanted to focus on these new guys, this 2000s space race.
What does space flight with Virgin Galactic entail?
This is not a conventional rocket.
So like I said, Blue Origin has been working on this for over 20 years. Bezos founded Blue Origin in the 2000s, yes, with all the money that he made around the dot-com bubble with Amazon. But they are yet to send anything to orbit. They have some passengers that barely left the atmosphere, but nothing to orbit. Now, Virgin Galactic comes as the fastest to achieve that. So Branson established that in 2017, and it took them just 5 years to launch a successful, contracted, paid-for mission to launch things. Now, Rocket Lab doesn't get a lot of publicity on this side of the world, but they are part of this race as well. It was founded by Peter Beck in New Zealand, and it took them 12 years to finally land a contract. But they have been taking contracts since 2018, and they're the first South Hemisphere-based private space company. And so for 2022, they now have 12+ launches in queue. They're all contracted and paid for. And of course, the cool kid on the block here is SpaceX. And we can't really argue with Elon's popularity, and now he's sort of embedded himself into pop culture. Now, it took 8 years for SpaceX to do their first commercial flight, and out of this new generation of space startups, SpaceX is by far the largest, at least in terms of revenue, and honestly in terms of everything else. SpaceX's popularity and their reusable rockets have allowed it to establish as the spearhead of innovation in this world. And they are unquestionably far ahead. So they're already deploying Starlink. I think it's almost 1,000 satellites now to provide satellite internet. And you can go and sign up for the beta if you want. SpaceX is also the first with a vehicle that can transport a crew into orbit, which has been hired by NASA to ferry astronauts to the space station. It returned capability to the US to launch their own astronauts into space without having to rely on Russia. But they've of course used it to put tourists in orbit as well. So even if they're the only US vehicle that can put astronauts in space, Boeing is expected to have their Starliner vehicle ready this year, 2022, and compete with SpaceX directly on that. But the planned flights they have so far are only commercial flights. Tourists going to the International Space Station, which we have not seen since Guy Liberté went there in 2009. They sort of closed it for tourists for a while. Anyway, Boeing is also collaborating with Blue Origin and with other companies to launch their own space station, which is going to be called Orbital Reef. And they aren't the only ones. Axiom Space, established in 2016, is developing an annex that is supposed to be just for tourists. It's like the hotel in the ISS. So the moment investors and not governments are the owners of ships, people with deep pockets are bound to become the new astronauts. In the 90s, there was one single company taking tourists to space, and they essentially leveraged government agencies to fly these millionaires astronauts. Kind of like a travel agency. But this new generation of companies, they understand that people want to go to space. They understand that there are enough people to pay for this and to turn it into an industry. But let's go back to that original question. Who is going to take us to Mars?
If we can do this, just imagine what you can do.
If you're rich, famous, or you know somebody who is.
A lot of companies and projects have kind of tried and failed. And right now, there are only 2 active efforts to go to Mars. NASA and SpaceX separately. As much as these are friends and partners, customers of each other, this is a race, just like before. NASA has their own team of people working on going to Mars and using the moon as a stepping stone. But when Elon Musk talks about his Mars colonization plans, he's not talking about a NASA contract. SpaceX is using about 5% of their budget to realize their own vision of colonizing Mars. Plans to land an unmanned ship as soon as 2024. But get this, this is not a funded by NASA mission or by any agency. It's funded by their own profits and their investors. Because now there is money to be made in space. It's not just exploration, it's profit. So when this finally happens, there might just be more than one flag on that planet. For the first time, it's a company, not a country, that might conquer these worlds beyond. And if the governments don't want to fund it, then why shouldn't investors be able to?